Peace be upon you. Let me tell you, dear viewers, the story of those who want to prove their falsehood in any way possible. How miserable they seem, moving from one failure to another, while being chased by the truth. But don't worry, we won't share their misery. Rather, there's a lot of humor in their story, so join us. In the last 2 episodes, we saw how Darwin founded the elements of his myth on the edge of a crumbling precipice, upon which his supporters continued to build until it collapsed into more contradictions with mind and science. It is not a matter of corrected mistakes or bridged gaps, but of expanded cracks. So, metaphorically, a goat, even if it flies. The modifications only made the theory more fictional and more contradictory to scientific discoveries. They say, but this theory has evidence, and those who came after Darwin gathered more evidence. Let's take a look at this alleged evidence. First, fossils. According to Darwin, living organisms slowly and gradually evolved from one or a few common ancestors. It follows that we should continue to see this gradualism. However, in reality, we find great differences and isolating boundaries. For example, where are the living transitional forms between reptiles and birds? They do not exist nowadays. Darwin admitted that this contradicted his imaginings. So he came up with an alternate fantasy, that gradualism and transitional forms existed in the past. So, their fossils and petrified remains must be underground. There is no justification for this evasion, and about turn from the surface of Earth to below its ground. But let's go underground, with Darwin. What did Darwin imagine that we would find? He imagined that we would find fossils of primitive, simple structured organisms in the Earth's deep layers, and, as we ascended through the Earth's rock layers, we'd find fossils of extinct creatures with increasingly complex structures representing the transitional stages. This would continue until we find in the top layers fossils of organisms that still exist today. In reality, Darwin scribbled these fantasies in his books and predicted innumerable fossils of extinct transitional forms buried in the rock layers. To illustrate, this simple organism, from which life supposedly started, would be found in the deep layers. Each point on this line represents an extinct organism. Here's one, here's another, and so on. Here's an advanced organism, the dinosaur, for example. But as it became extinct long ago, we'd only find it in very deep rock layers. In the middle, we'd find the innumerable transitional forms between dinosaurs and birds, all the way up until we see the organisms living with us today, in the higher layers and so on. These were Darwin's dreams. This was what he hoped to see in order to claim that his theory was correct. But what did Darwin actually find? Everything he found contradicted his dreams. First, a large number of extremely complex organisms appearing suddenly in the deep layer, known as the Cambrian period. They even call this sudden emergence, the Cambrian explosion. No candidate for the simpler common ancestor, per Darwin's dreams, appeared. Rather, organisms appeared suddenly. In order to realize the complexity of the Cambrian organisms, contemplate the eye of the trilobite fossil, which is made up of hundreds of sophisticated tiny eyes that work collectively. Second, Darwin found that transitional forms were not innumerable, as his myth stipulated. Rather, they were non-existent. So the evidence was piling up against Darwin's assumptions. Was Darwin unaware of this? No, he was fully aware. Some people think that these discoveries came after Darwin, while, in fact, they were during his lifetime. Darwin spoke extensively about the Cambrian explosion organisms. He also reflected on the absence of transitional forms, saying, "But, as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the Earth?" So, did that wake you up from your dreams, Darwin? No. The myth must continue. Instead of titling his confessions, "The fossil record shatters my dreams, just like the absence of living transitional forms," he titled it in his book as On the Imperfection of the Fossil Record. Imperfection? What if we discover any fossil after that? Shouldn't we logically explain it in accordance with the unassailable principles that we already know, Darwin? Apparently not, as if Darwin told his successors, "Look for anything open to interpretation and use it to distort these unassailable principles. Fetch any straw to block the sunlight from people's eyes." And indeed, Darwin's loyal soldiers rushed to seek the alleged transitional forms, ignoring the fact that their teacher's myth requires innumerable transitional forms. So they looked everywhere for goats that fly, even a single goat. They moved from one failure to another. Every transitional form they claimed to have found was demonstrated through peer-reviewed studies to be a mistake or misinterpretation, just like the story of the bird-like dinosaur, the Archaeoraptor, coelacanth, Tiktaalik, the skull of Piltdown Man, the Java Man bones. Then, the Lucy fossil, the Ida fossil, the Ardipithecus fossil, and many more. Their mindset: ignore all evidence for the creator in this universe and drown it out so that you may prevail. All of these fossils and others, as we'll show in detail, Allah willing, turned out to be either intentional forgeries or misrepresentations. They were exposed one after the other, but only after every lie was used to revive the myth for a while. So that you don't get depressed by this miserable scene and stories of failure, we'll share some comedic scenes performed by the stars of the metaphorical series Darwin's Myth. In 1922, the myth lovers found a molar in Nebraska, USA. Yes, a molar. They considered it important evidence for evolution. From the molar, they drew a human-like creature, claimed that it lived 6 million years ago, and gave it a scientific name. Science magazine published a scientific peer-reviewed article on this great discovery. Alas, 5 years later, it was discovered to be a pig's tooth. Science published a retraction of its previous article on this great discovery. Then, in 1979, the myth lovers found a bone, which they hailed as evidence. They claimed it was a clavicle of a human-like ancestor. Alas, it turned out to be part of a dolphin's rib, as published in New Scientist 4 years later. Then, in 1984, 3 myth zealots found a skull fragment, which excited them greatly. Finally, some real evidence. They etched around this fragment a human-like creature that they claimed to have died at 17 years old, and to have lived 900,000 to 1.6 million years ago. They called it Orseman. They designated a place for him in the so-called evolutionary ladder, and the discovery was called the Discovery of the Century. Moreover, a press conference attended by VIPs was held to celebrate. Alas, they celebrated too soon. It turned out to be the skull of a baby donkey. They became the laughingstock of satirical magazines. So the myth lovers wander around plains and mountains and search dumpsters and cemeteries, looking for their roots in everything beneath their feet: pig molars, dolphin ribs, and donkey skulls. Just like hallucinating idiots who see shiny spit as a coin. All that for the sake of the myth. This, in short, is the story of the fossil evidence. I remind you, dear viewers, that this episode is a quick review. Full details will be provided in the coming episodes, Allah willing. The second type of evidence is signs of chance in useless organs. In his book, The Descent of Man, which he published after On the Origin of Species, Darwin mentioned many examples of useless atrophied organs in the human body as evidence for evolution. He called them vestigial organs. He reasoned that, as long as man came by multiple chance events, then chance must have left a footprint on its products, i.e., evolutionary vestiges and remnants of animal ancestors that no longer have a function in the human body. With this, Darwin opened a door for his supporters to rush through. They scrutinized the human body and inspected it part by part. Looking for what? Looking for errors. The Darwinist German anatomist Robert Wiedersheim in 1893 published his list of 86 useless vestigial organs in the human body. You'll realize, dear viewer, the degree of their ignorance which made them a laughingstock when you know this list included the endocrine glands, such as the pituitary and pineal glands, because at that time they knew nothing about endocrine glands and hormones. They committed the fallacy of arguing from ignorance. We don't know the function of these organs in the human body. Therefore, these organs have no function and they must have evolved unintentionally. It's the same methodology they used with the fossil record, ignoring unassailable and clear facts. The perfection and design ingenuity in the human body is disregarded, and they run around seeking straws to cling to. However, science has discovered important functions for these useless organs, one after another. So, the coccygeal vertebrae isn't useless, nor is the appendix superfluous, and the pituitary gland controls most of the hormones in the body, and those who described it as vestigial couldn't have lived without it. Then, they set out seeking useless organs in other creatures and making wild deductions on the assumption that nature only retains vital organs. A circular deduction that starts with the premise they want to prove, while we believe in a creator who instilled beauty in his creation. Even if some parts don't support survival or mating, they are signs, for those sound of mind, that such beauty requires a creator. Yet, they are still looking everywhere, even in the finely tuned physical constants of the universe, as if they are saying, "O blind randomness, guide us to your footprints in any corner of this universe." The response comes to them from the Book of Allah, which is translated as, "So look again. Do you see any flaws? Then look again and again. Your sight will return frustrated and weary. So, continue your fruitless search for faults in creation. They failed underground and above ground, so they started examining the genome, hoping to find what they seek. For me, personally, one of the clearest proofs for Allah's greatness comes from pondering the marvelous mechanisms in the cell nucleus, in the genetic material. However, just like Quranic signs, cosmic signs are only relevant for the believers. As for those who have attained faith, it increases them in faith, and they rejoice. But as for those in whose hearts is disease, it has only increased them in evil. The myth lovers announced, "There, found it. Only a small part of the DNA includes active genes, while most of it is useless junk, without a function, just remnants of random evolution. If a wise creator exists, why would he create junk DNA?" Then, the many indispensable functions of this so-called junk DNA and its hidden treasures were discovered. As termed by Professor Ewan Birney, the leader of the ENCODE consortium of 400 geneticists. So it seems that the junk was in the perceptions of Darwinists and their attitudes towards Allah's fine-tuned creation. Dawkins said,
"I have noticed that there are some creationists who are jumping on it because they think that's awkward for Darwinism. Quite the contrary, of course, it's exactly what a Darwinist would hope for."
Dawkins tells you that it's exactly what Darwinism would hope for. It's pig-headedness, for the sake of the myth. We will discuss, in the coming episodes, Allah willing, in detail their false claims about DNA, such as the similarity of DNA in humans and chimpanzees and their other lies, so that you know how they abuse science, the mind, and themselves, for the sake of the myth. The fourth evidence, dear viewers, that Darwin relied greatly upon was the presence of a few superficial morphological and anatomical similarities between some organisms. His view of similarities as evidence of common ancestry is neither scientific nor logical. One argument that invalidates this as evidence is the extreme resemblance between placental and marsupial mammals. A placental mammal is one whose fetus completes its growth in the placenta of the uterus, while the fetus of a marsupial mammal completes its growth in an external pouch like the kangaroo. According to Darwinists, marsupials were separated from placentals in ancient ages, and each developed significantly different body systems, pregnancies, and lactation mechanisms. So, the placental squirrel, for example, is more closely related in classification and placement on the phylogenetic tree to the whale, elephant, deer, and all other well-known placental mammals than it is to the marsupial squirrel. While a marsupial squirrel is more related to kangaroos and koalas than to the placental squirrel that looks like it. The same can be said about the wolf, mole, wombat, and many other placentals and marsupials. What does this mean? It means that morphological and anatomical similarities don't have any evolutionary indication. Thus, animals that look alike may differ greatly in their physiological systems and pregnancies, and those that are physiologically similar may differ greatly in appearance. What did the Darwinists do to get out of this dilemma? They proposed the convergent evolution model, also known as parallel evolution. Fancy names, aren't they? Once delirium is given a name, it gains scientific legitimacy. But wait a minute. This blasts your theory from its foundation. Not at all. We've modified the theory and given it a name in the style of give it a name and let it go. Keep this style in mind because you'll see it repeated often. A phenomenon that invalidates your theory? No problem. Give the theory a new name so the audience feels that you're aware of this phenomenon. You don't see that it presents any threat to your theory, and you've amended the theory and found a solution. While, in reality, you didn't find a solution. You only invented a new false name for the sake of the myth. So, what is the concept of convergent evolution? It is a funny idea stating that the random mutations which created placental organisms were repeated with the same randomness and details to create marsupial organisms. Perfectly organized random events, even though they are supposedly countless. No comment. So, when they tell you, modern discoveries are challenges, and the theory of evolution can be adapted to include them without faulting the general structure of the theory, they're referring to such changes. Changes in the eye of the needle of the myth to squeeze the whole universe inside it. The fifth proof is embryological similarity. In 1868, the German zoologist Ernst Haeckel published drawings, which he claimed to have observed under the microscope, of human and animal embryos allegedly showing great similarities in the early stages of pregnancy. Darwin rejoiced in this discovery, and he credited Haeckel for spreading the concept of evolution across Germany, as mentioned in Encyclopedia Britannica. Besides the fact that similarity doesn't indicate common ancestry in any way, lies are short-lived. Haeckel was not the only one with a microscope, so other scientists questioned Haeckel's drawings and created a stir around them, until he was forced in 1909 to admit in his letter to Allgemeine Zeitung that there was forgery in his drawings. Even during his confession, Haeckel lied. He said that a small percentage of his drawings, 6 to 8%, were indeed fake, but that he did it to bridge the gaps because of the impossibility of obtaining complete and accurate images for the embryos. The irony here is that 1.5 centuries have passed since Haeckel's exposed lie, yet his drawings are still relentlessly recycled in thousands of schools, universities, and science books, shamelessly. Biology by Raven and Johnson, Biology by Starr and Taggart, Evolutionary Biology by Futuyma, and many more. Even the Darwinist Stephen Gould in his book Natural History says, "We do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks." These are the same books and references that issue new editions every year or two in an effort to keep their information up to date. In our courses, it's considered a breach of scientific integrity to teach students the therapeutic guidelines published in 2015, for example, if a more recently published edition is available, while these people cling to a stinking lie that was exposed a long time ago, all for the sake of the myth. We are entitled to ask, if evolution was truly the secret of life, why can't its advocates find anything other than lies and regurgitated falsehoods to support it? Why do they follow the recommendation of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister? If you repeat a lie often enough, people will believe it. And if you lie even more, you'll even start believing it yourself. When some Muslims repeat, in a parrot-like fashion, that there are thousands of proofs for evolution, they are referring to such proofs. However, for the sake of scientific integrity, there is one remaining area of discovery that is in line with Darwinism. Discoveries in Photoshop and innovations in Hollywood cinematography, which the Darwinists resort to, just as a loser resorts to hallucinogens to allow him to live in his illusionary world. Discoveries which weave from a few bones fantasy creatures with fat, flesh, eyes, hair, and facial features. Then, these fantasy creatures are used to normalize the myth in the media and school curricula to make you feel that you are facing solid historical facts. Imagine a young man looking for a girl with specific features whom he cannot find. Then, after years of searching, he goes back home, draws the girl of his dreams, and flirts sorrowfully with the drawing. The task of these people is harder because the girl of their dreams is a flying goat. They resorted to Photoshop after everything in the universe screamed in their faces, losers. They couldn't prop up the collapsed legs of Darwin's table with its heavy load, the load of all living creatures. They tried, in vain, to turn the observations from the universe that were loaded onto the table into legs to support the table, but evidential science slaps their wrists every time and tells them, "Don't even try, losers. These observations are against you, not in your favor." Dear viewer, you might say, if the myth of evolution has failed miserably in front of the most obvious universal truth, that living things have an all-knowing creator, why do many people believe in it? This will be the topic of our upcoming episodes. Let's keep in mind that the evolution myth is an example of a larger issue. It provides the model answer for the question, how can pseudoscience missionaries brainwash people's minds to reject faith in the most obvious truth and accept the most ridiculous of myths? So, dear viewers, stay tuned. May the peace of Allah be upon you.